All right, first of all, this video is about cyclic electron flow, but before I talk about that, I just want to remind us what linear is. So linear electron flow is when our electrons come into our thylakoid membrane at the photosystem number 2. They go through the electron transport chain that leads to this concentration gradient. They end up at photosystem 1. They get recharged with more sunlight, so they get a lot of energy there, and then they end up at NADP plus reductase. So they're forming pretty much a straight line. But where are these electrons coming from? They're coming from water. What if you don't water your plants enough? What if we're in a drought? The trees and plants outside aren't getting enough water. If they're not getting enough water, they're not going to have the electrons to keep feeding this pathway. And so plants have a backup plan, kind of like fermentation is our backup plan. Plants have a backup plan too, and it's called cyclic electron flow. Cyclic because it's going to be moving in a cycle. And then, of course, electron flow because it's how electrons are moving. So I've drawn kind of a very simple thylakoid membrane. Here's photosystem 2, photosystem 1. If we had water, it would be split over here, and it would be providing electrons to photosystem 2. They would be traveling down this electron transport chain and coming to photosystem 1, where they would be really tired. They would get re-energized with some sunlight. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit. And they would then take that energy they have and they would go over here. However, we don't want to send our electrons here because then they're all going to get tied up in NADPH. And if they all get tied up in NADPH, then we're just stuck with a bunch of NADPH and we can't do anything. We've got to be able to keep creating this concentration gradient so that we can keep creating ATP. This is ATP synthase down here. Okay. So what we're going to do is instead of sending our electrons forward, we're going to recycle them and we're going to send them back to the beginning of the electron transport chain. So they're going to come into this electron transport chain. They're going to zoom down through it through redox reactions, right? As it receives it, it's reduced. As it sends it on, it's oxidized and that one's reduced. As it sends it on, this one's reduced and that one's oxidized, and then it'll send it back to photosystem 1. What this means is because we're doing this electron transport chain, remember these electrons got energy from this sunlight, so they're high energy coming in here. They're giving their energy to those molecules and they can pump those H's in, which means we still have a high concentration of H plus in here, which means they can still come out, which means we can still produce ATP from ADP, okay? So we can still do this photophosphorylation, we can still get our ATP, and we can stay alive. So cyclic electron flow is simply where instead of sending our electrons forward in that linear shape, I guess you could say, we recycle them back. They come back down, pump H's in, they get here, they're tired, they get zoop, another bit of sunlight, and they go back. And so plants will just keep doing this. It doesn't produce any NADPH, so they can't do glycolysis, but it does produce ATP, which they can use to do whatever they need to do. So the whole point of glycolysis, not glycolysis, the Calvin cycle, the dark reactions, sorry, I misspoke. What plants want to do is they want to produce glucose over here in the light independent reactions that we'll talk about later, and they want to use that glucose later. They're going to do respiration and break it down into ATP. So the glucose isn't the goal. I mean, it is, but the glucose is like a $100 bill that they're going to put in savings. What they're going to do later with that glucose is they're going to break it back down into ATP to use, because the cell can't use glucose, it can use ATP. And so if we can just keep doing this and keep making ATP, we can keep that plant alive, kind of limping along. It's not going to be growing a bunch and producing fruit and all this high energy stuff, but it's going to stay alive until we get more water. Once we get more water, your hydrogens will be, your water will be split, you'll get new electrons, and you can go back to doing linear, where you make the NADPH and the ATP, and then you can go to the dark reaction and make your glucose. But so again, the cyclic electron flow is what plants do when they're low on water. And it's just a way for them to stay alive, make a little bit of ATP, and kind of limp along until they get water again. So that is the process of cyclic electron flow, as well as why organisms do it. I hope that helps. If you have any questions, let me know.